A black airline pilot, off-duty and looking forward to a quiet flight home, steps into the airport with the dignity earned from years of hard work. But in the blink of an eye, everything changes. A senior flight attendant singles him out, questioning his right to board first class, humiliating him with thinly veiled prejudice. Yet, just 7 minutes later, a life-threatening emergency puts the entire plane in jeopardy and this same pilot becomes their only hope. What happens next leaves everyone speechless and ignites a powerful conversation about bias, resilience, and redemption. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more moments that challenge and inspire. The terminal pulsed with life, hurried footsteps echoing across the tiled floor, announcements cutting sharply through the air, and the low hum of voices rising and falling in fragments of conversation. Somewhere in the symphony of movement stood Noah Carter, tall and dignified, a man of middle years with the steady gaze of someone who had seen more of the world than it cared to admit. His tailored navy suit and polished shoes were not a statement but an armor, silently insisting he belonged. Noah adjusted his grip on the leather carry-on bag, worn smooth by years of travel. Tucked in its side pocket was his pilot's license, unassuming yet hard-earned, a symbol of countless sleepless nights and unflinching determination. He moved toward the first-class boarding line, his steps purposeful, his expression calm, though there was a weight in the air that followed him like a shadow. To live as Noah Carter did a black man in America, with success carved out of the bedrock of doubt, was to exist in a constant negotiation of space. Every stride forward came with a silent, unspoken question from the world around him. What are you doing here? It was a question he learned not to answer aloud but to counter with his presence. His quiet defiance in the face of expectation. At the front of the line stood Catherine Bell, the senior flight attendant, a woman whose uniform was as crisp and polished as her tightly held demeanor. She glanced up at Noah as he approached, her expression slipping briefly from professional neutrality into something colder, sharper. It was subtle, a momentary narrowing of the eyes, the faint tightening of her lips, but it was enough to announce her assumptions before she even spoke. "Excuse me, sir," Catherine said, her voice carrying the thin, brittle edge of forced politeness. "Are you sure you're in the right line? Economy boarding is over there." She gestured vaguely toward the bustling crowd beyond, her manicured hand cutting through the air like a blade. Noah paused, his dark eyes meeting hers with quiet resolve. He said nothing at first, letting the weight of her question hang between them, heavy and sharp. Then, with the same steady calm he brought to every turbulence, he held out his boarding pass. Catherine's fingers grazed the scanner, her nails tapping softly against the plastic. For a brief moment, her composure cracked as her eyes flicked to the screen, widening ever so slightly. There it was, in unmistakable black and white: Noah Carter, Seat 3A, First Class. "Enjoy your flight," she said, handing back the pass with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. As he stepped past her, Noah caught the faint mutter under her breath. "Quiet but not quiet enough. Looks like they're letting just anyone into first class these days." Noah's shoulders stiffened. He took a breath, steadying himself as years of practice rose to meet the moment. He walked on, past the murmuring passengers, past the covert glances and subtle shifts in posture that rippled around him like a current. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Inside the jet bridge, the air was cooler, quieter, though the tension lingered. Noah placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, his movements deliberate, his face impassive. He knew the drill. People like Catherine weren't unique, they were part of the rhythm of his life. The steady drumbeat of skepticism that followed him into boardrooms, onto sidewalks, and even into the sanctuary of first class. He settled into his seat, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Around him, the cabin came alive with the motions of boarding, passengers stowing bags, attendants exchanging clipped instructions, the faint chime of seatbelt signs. Catherine moved through the aisle, her demeanor professional but her warmth reserved for certain passengers: a middle-aged white man in a tailored blazer, an older couple in matching golf shirts, while others, like Noah, were given only what courtesy demanded. Noah observed it all, quietly, the way one observes the pattern of a storm forming on the horizon. He had long since learned to read these shifts. The subtle choreography of inclusion and exclusion. It was in the way Catherine lingered at some rows, offering a smile and a joke, while others received only a perfunctory nod. It was in the way her eyes scanned him, as though searching for some reason to validate her earlier skepticism. "Would you like water or juice?" she asked curtly when she finally reached his seat. "Water, please," Noah said, his tone steady, though the dryness of her delivery scraped against him like sandpaper. She set the cup down with a faint clatter, spilling a few drops onto the napkin before moving briskly to the next row without so much as a glance. From the corner of his eye, Noah caught the expression of the young flight attendant nearby, Evan Lopez. With kind eyes and a tentative smile, Evan looked at Noah as if he wanted to say something, but the words faltered, held back by an unspoken rule: don't challenge the hierarchy. Blank. Blank. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Noah leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly against the hum of the engines. But even as the plane lifted into the sky, the weight in his chest did not ease. For all its soaring heights, the world often felt painfully, impossibly small, its boundaries drawn tighter by the prejudices of others. He thought of Catherine's face, her fleeting surprise at his boarding pass, and wondered how many times she had performed this silent arithmetic: appearance versus expectation, skin color versus seat number. It wasn't anger he felt, but something more corrosive: exhaustion. The slow erosion of a lifetime spent pushing back against assumptions. For now, he remains steady, his focus ahead. He knows the journey is just beginning, and the air, however thin, still holds room for flight. The plane leveled off, leaving behind the patchwork of city lights, the dark grid fading into endless night. Inside the cabin, the quiet buzz of passengers settling in for the flight filled the air. Conversations drifted like smoke, polite and inconsequential, as drinks were poured and bags tucked away. Noah Carter sat in his seat, his posture straight but not stiff, his eyes trained on the window where stars were beginning to appear. Distant but steady, the quiet should have been comforting, but instead, it carried a tension as sharp as glass. The weight of the earlier encounter with Catherine Bell lingered, an unspoken thing that hung in the air between them. Noah could feel it, an absence where respect should have been, a space that others filled with their stolen glances, their whispered murmurs. Catherine moved through the cabin like a conductor, her smile bright for some and thin for others, her rhythm deliberate. She paused to offer a glass of wine to the businessman across the aisle, leaning in close enough to exchange a joke that coaxed a deep, rumbling laugh from him. "Thank you so much," the man said warmly, his voice carrying just enough to emphasize her courtesy. When Catherine reached Noah's row, her movements became brisk, clipped. Without meeting his eyes, she placed a napkin and a plastic cup of water on his tray. The cup wobbled, spilling a thin line of water onto the napkin, but she didn't pause to notice, or perhaps didn't care to. She turned sharply to the next passenger, her tone immediately brightening as she offered an elderly couple across the aisle a basket of snacks with a warmth that bordered on affection. Noah stared at the cup for a moment, his jaw tightening, the faint tremor in his hand betraying the stillness of his face. It wasn't the water, it wasn't the napkin, it wasn't even Catherine's voice, clipped and dismissive. It was the accumulation, the layers upon layers of moments like these, moments that chipped away at the foundation of dignity until all that remained was the question: what more must I do to simply exist here? From a few rows back, a young woman leaned toward her husband. She had watched the exchange, her expression a mixture of confusion and disapproval. "Did you see that?" she whispered. She didn't even look at him. Her husband grunted, his eyes still on his tablet. "Probably nothing," he muttered, but his tone carried the hollow weight of someone who knew better and preferred silence to confrontation. The young woman frowned, her gaze drifting back to Noah, who sat with his hands folded over his lap, his face unreadable. She reached for her phone and tilted it slightly, angling her camera toward the aisle. The cabin settled into a hum as Catherine returned to the galley. There, Evan Lopez, the younger flight attendant, watched her with nervous energy. Evan wasn't one for confrontation, but something about Catherine's interactions with Noah gnawed at him. He had noticed it during boarding, and it hadn't stopped since. "Do you think he's upset?" Evan asked, glancing toward Noah's seat. Catherine shrugged, not looking up from the drinks cart she was rearranging. "He hasn't said anything," she replied, her voice light but pointed. People like him usually don't. Like him? Evan pressed, his voice lowering despite himself. You know what I mean, Catherine said, finally meeting his eyes with a look that dared him to disagree. They're always looking for something to be upset about. Best to keep it professional and move on. Evan's stomach turned at her words. But he said nothing, his hands fidgeted at his sides. The urge to speak colliding with the fear of what it might cost him. The silence between them was thick. The kind of silence that carried complicity. Back in his seat, Noah glanced around the cabin, sensing the ripples of discomfort. He saw the young woman with her phone, the elderly couple murmuring to each other, the businessman who glanced at him briefly before burying himself back in his work. They weren't indifferent, he could see that much, but they were hesitant. Their reactions muted by years of learned passivity. This was how it always was. Noah thought. People saw, they knew, but they rarely acted. It wasn't hatred that perpetuated these moments. It was something quieter, something more insidious. The belief that someone else would do the hard work of speaking up. Noah's mind wandered back to his own life. The years he had spent climbing the ranks in aviation. He had worked twice as hard as his peers, knowing that one mistake would be enough to erase years of effort. He had endured the casual skepticism of colleagues, the pointed questions from passengers who couldn't fathom a black man at the controls of a plane. And through it all, he had kept moving forward, refusing to let their doubt define him. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin grew more palpable. Catherine's attitude hadn't gone unnoticed, and the passengers began to exchange uneasy glances. The young woman with the phone had started recording snippets of Catherine's interactions, her quiet defiance sparking a ripple of awareness among those seated nearby. Even the elderly couple, who had been laughing moments earlier, now wore solemn expressions as they observed the disparity in Catherine's behavior. The breaking point came when Catherine returned to Noah's row with a forced smile, her eyes avoiding his. Anything else for you? She asked, her tone coldly perfunctory. Noah met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. No, thank you, he said evenly, the deliberate politeness in his voice carrying a weight that was not lost on her. Catherine stiffened, her jaw tightening. She turned on her heel and walked away. But not before a passenger nearby, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, spoke up. That was uncalled for, the woman said, loud enough for Catherine to hear. Catherine froze, her composure faltering for a moment before she turned back toward the galley. Her steps quick and rigid. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, their discomfort finally finding a voice. Noah sat back in his seat, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. He didn't smile, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. For once, the silence had been broken not by him, but by those who had finally decided enough was enough. Above the hum of the engines, the plane continued its journey. But the air inside the cabin felt heavier now, charged with an unspoken reckoning. Noah closed his eyes, bracing himself for what he knew was still to come. This was only the beginning. The cabin lights dimmed to an amber glow, signaling the beginning of the quiet hours. A low hum of the engines filled the space, steady and indifferent, as though the tension rippling through the plane belonged to another world. Noah Carter sat in his seat, the faint scent of recycled air and coffee lingering around him, his hands folded neatly on his lap. To anyone looking, he appeared composed, his face a mask of calm. But behind his stillness was the slow churn of familiar exhaustion. Catherine Bell reappeared in the aisle, her movements precise, as though each step were a demonstration of her control. She pushed the snack cart with a practiced air, her smile re-emerging when she approached certain passengers, a young couple sharing a blanket, a gray-haired man with a distinguished tie. But the warmth in her face dimmed as she reached Noah. She paused, her eyes flicking to him briefly, then to the empty tray table in front of him. Would you care for a snack? She asked, her voice thin, more obligation than offer. Thank you, but no, Noah replied, his voice polite but firm. He kept his eyes on her, studying the lines of tension in her jaw, the small hesitations that betrayed her discomfort. She didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't even acknowledge his words. Instead, she turned sharply and moved to the next row, her demeanor brightening as she addressed an older woman with a floral scarf. Can I get you anything else, ma'am? Catherine asked warmly, her tone softening to the point of indulgence. Noah leaned back, exhaling slowly. He could feel the glances from other passengers again. Some fleeting, others lingering. The young woman with the phone angled her camera just slightly, her fingers grazing the screen. Across the aisle, the elderly woman who had spoken up earlier glanced toward Noah again, her expression heavy with sympathy. There was an unspoken understanding that filled the space now. They all saw it, the subtle shift in Catherine's tone, her careful avoidance of Noah's gaze, the invisible but impenetrable line she had drawn between him and everyone else. Minutes passed, the cabin settling again into uneasy quiet, when the plane jolted suddenly, rattling trays and overhead bins. Gasps rippled through the passengers as the plane dipped slightly before righting itself. The seatbelt sign flickered on with a chime, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Catherine appeared from the galley, her usual poise faltering as she hurried through the aisle, ensuring passengers were secure. She stopped at Noah's row, her voice brisk but edged with something that might have been panic. "Sir, please make sure your seatbelt is fastened tightly," she said, her tone sharper than necessary. "It already is," Noah replied evenly, lifting his hands slightly to show the belt secured across his lap. For a moment, their eyes met, and Catherine's face flickered with something annoyance, perhaps, or the weight of knowing she was under scrutiny. She nodded curtly and moved on, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a tray table for a passenger a few rows ahead. The turbulence grew worse, shaking the plane with each passing minute. Noah's fingers tightened around the armrests, his years of experience as a pilot guiding his instincts. He closed his eyes, mentally running through the likely scenarios in the cockpit: sudden wind shear, a minor equipment failure, perhaps a miscalculation in altitude. Then came the moment every traveler dreads: a voice over the intercom. Strained and urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. We are experiencing a medical emergency with our captain and are working to stabilize the situation. Please remain seated and follow instructions from the flight attendants." The murmurs began instantly, spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Catherine froze mid-step, her face pale as she glanced toward the cockpit door. She turned quickly, disappearing into the galley. Noah's eyes opened, his mind already assessing the implications. He had been in enough cockpits to know the weight of such an announcement. The delicate balance required to navigate both a medical emergency and a plane full of anxious passengers. His training kicked in, his body leaning forward slightly as he considered whether he should step in. Catherine re-emerged moments later, her composure cracking as she spoke in hushed tones to Evan and another flight attendant. Noah watched as their faces shifted, Evan's widening in alarm while Catherine's mouth formed a tight line. She glanced toward Noah, then quickly looked away, her discomfort growing more evident with every passing second. Finally, Evan approached Noah, his steps hesitant but purposeful. He leaned in, his voice low. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude, but, are you really a pilot? I thought I saw your license earlier," he said, his words tumbling out quickly, as though he might lose his nerve if he spoke too slowly. "I am," Noah replied, his voice calm, steady. He reached into his bag and pulled out the small laminated card, holding it up for Evan to see. "Commercial. Over a decade of experience." Evan's shoulders seemed to relax slightly, though his expression remained strained. He hesitated, glancing toward Catherine, who stood stiffly by the galley, her face carefully blank. "We might need your help," Evan said, his voice quieter now. "The co-pilot is overwhelmed, and the turbulence isn't letting up." Before Noah could respond, Catherine stepped forward, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. "That won't be necessary," she said sharply. "This is a professional emergency, and we can't have passengers interfering." Evan flinched but didn't back down. "He's a pilot, Catherine, an experienced one. The co-pilot might." "I said it's not necessary," Catherine interrupted, her voice rising slightly. Her eyes darted toward Noah, her expression a mix of skepticism and something deeper. Something that betrayed the unspoken truth. She didn't trust him. Noah stood slowly, his full height emphasizing his presence. His voice, when he spoke, was measured, deliberate. "I understand your hesitation," he said, meeting Catherine's gaze directly. "But this isn't about you or me. It's about everyone on this plane. Every second we waste could mean the difference between a safe landing and a tragedy." Catherine faltered, her mouth opening slightly as if to argue. But no words came. The tension in the aisle was palpable. Passengers craning their necks to watch the unfolding scene. The young woman with the phone held it steady, her recording light blinking softly. Evan stepped forward, his voice firm now. "We don't have time for this. Catherine, I'm calling the cockpit." Catherine hesitated a moment longer, then stepped aside, her face tight with reluctance. Evan nodded to Noah, gesturing for him to follow. As Noah walked toward the cockpit, the passengers watched him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Some whispered prayers under their breath, while others simply stared, their faces pale with fear. Catherine lingered by the galley, her expression unreadable but her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. Noah squared his shoulders, his focus sharpening. Whatever doubts Catherine or the passengers might have, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he belonged here, and he would do whatever it took to bring them safely home. The cockpit door opened, and the chaos inside greeted him like an old adversary. The storm wasn't over, not yet. But Noah Carter was ready. The cockpit was chaos. Warning lights blinked furiously across the control panel, casting flashes of red and amber onto the faces of the co-pilot and Noah Carter. The young co-pilot, barely in his 30s, sat stiff in his seat, beads of sweat lining his forehead. He looked up at Noah with a mixture of hope and desperation, his hands gripping the controls as if letting go would send the plane spiraling. "I'm barely keeping her steady," the co-pilot said, his voice tight with strain. "The turbulence is pulling us off course." And the captain?" He glanced toward the slumped figure in the pilot's chair, his words faltering. Noah's eyes darted across the cockpit, quickly assessing the situation. The turbulence was fierce, the plane shuddering like a leaf caught in a gale. Yet, even amidst the chaos, Noah's movements were deliberate, his focus sharp. He reached for the headset hanging near the controls, his voice calm as he addressed the co-pilot. "I'll take the controls," Noah said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You focus on communications. Let's work together." The co-pilot hesitated for only a moment before nodding, relief washing over his face as Noah slid into the captain's seat, his hands steady on the yoke. The plane groaned under the strain of the storm, each shudder sending ripples of unease through the passengers. In the cabin, the tension was palpable. People clung to their armrests, their faces pale as the plane jolted again. The overhead bins rattled ominously, and a woman let out a muffled sob. At the galley, Catherine Bell stood motionless, her earlier bravado now a faint memory. She stared down the aisle toward the cockpit, her face pale. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, a collision of doubt, pride, and something deeper, an unspoken recognition of how her assumptions had boxed her in. She couldn't admit it, not yet, but every moment the plane stayed aloft was a testament to the man she had dismissed. Evan Lopez, on the other hand, moved with purpose. He spoke to passengers in low, soothing tones, checking seatbelts and securing loose items. Each time he glanced toward Catherine, his expression grew more resolute. Finally, he approached her, his voice quiet but firm. "You should say something," Evan said. "To him, to the passengers. They're scared, and he's up there making sure we get out of this alive." Catherine's eyes flashed, but her voice faltered. "It's not the time." "It's exactly the time," Evan interrupted, his voice rising slightly. He glanced down the aisle, ensuring the passengers weren't listening, then continued, "I've seen how you've treated him. We all have, and now he's the only reason we might make it through this. You think nobody notices, but they do. He does." Catherine opened her mouth to respond but stopped. Her hands gripped the edge of the cart, her knuckles white. For the first time, she seemed to deflate, her sharp edges softening into something closer to vulnerability. In the cockpit, Noah's hands worked the controls with practiced precision, adjusting the heading and altitude to steady the plane. His mind was clear, his years of training overriding the noise of the storm and the chaos around him. "Bayfield International," he said into the radio, his voice calm. "This is Flight 523. We have an incapacitated captain and are requesting emergency landing clearance. Current position is..." He rattled off the coordinates with ease, the words a steady anchor in the turbulence. The response crackled through the headset. "Flight 523, you are cleared for runway 7L. Emergency services are on standby. Winds at 8 knots from the southeast. Roger that. Bayfield, Noah replied, his tone unwavering. He glanced at the co-pilot, who had regained some of his composure. We're going to start our descent. Focus on monitoring the instruments and keep communications open. The co-pilot nodded, his movements more confident now. For the first time since the emergency began, the faintest hint of a smile crossed his face. Thank you, he said quietly, almost to himself. I wasn't sure we'd make it. Noah didn't respond, but his grip on the controls tightened slightly. It wasn't the storm that worried him, it was the storm behind him. The one that simmered quietly in the cabin, waiting for the right moment to surface. As the plane began its descent, Catherine stepped into the aisle, her voice trembling as she addressed the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for an emergency landing, she said, her words rehearsed but her tone uncertain. The cabin crew will assist you in assuming the brace position. Thank you for your cooperation. Her announcement was met with murmurs of unease, the passengers shifting nervously in their seats. From her vantage point, Catherine could see their faces pale, wide-eyed, some whispering prayers. Her gaze drifted toward Noah's empty seat, and for a moment, she hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, she turned toward the galley, where Evan was helping a passenger secure a bag. I need to speak with him, Catherine said quietly, her voice almost swallowed by the hum of the engines. Evan looked up, surprised, but nodded. It's about time, he said simply. Inside the cockpit, Noah guided the plane with steady hands, his eyes scanning the instruments and the horizon in equal measure. The lights of Bayfield International Airport came into view, glowing faintly against the dark expanse. Landing gear down, Noah said, his voice calm as the co-pilot flipped the switch. The hum of the gear deploying filled the cabin, a sound that carried both relief and anticipation. The cockpit door opened behind them, and Catherine stepped inside. Her presence was hesitant, her usual confidence replaced by something quieter, almost fragile. She cleared her throat, and Noah glanced at her briefly before returning his focus to the controls. Catherine began, her voice unsteady. She paused, then tried again. I wanted to say, thank you. For everything you're doing. Noah didn't respond immediately. His hands moved over the controls with practiced ease, his focus unbroken. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured, deliberate. This isn't about me, he said simply. It's about everyone on this plane. Catherine's eyes flickered, her lips pressing into a thin line. I know that, she said softly, but I also know I've been unfair to you. I see that now. Noah didn't look at her, but his voice softened slightly. What matters is that we land this plane safely. Let's focus on that. Catherine nodded, retreating quietly to the galley. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions pressing heavily on her shoulders. A burden she couldn't shake. The runway rushed toward them, the plane shuddering slightly as Noah adjusted for a crosswind. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, followed by the roar of the thrust reversers. Inside the cabin, the passengers erupted into cheers and applause, their relief palpable. Noah guided the plane to a stop near the waiting emergency vehicles, his hands steady on the controls until the engines powered down. He leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply as the tension began to dissipate. In the silence that followed, the enormity of what had just happened settled over him. He had done his job, nothing more, nothing less, but in doing so, he had reminded everyone on board of a truth they could no longer ignore. Behind him, the door opened again. This time, it was Evan who stepped inside, his expression one of quiet gratitude. They're asking for you, Evan said simply. Noah nodded, rising from the captain's seat and straightening his jacket. He didn't need applause, didn't need accolades, but as he stepped into the cabin, he saw something different in the passengers' eyes: recognition, respect, and perhaps a glimmer of understanding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The plane was still, its engines quiet, but the silence inside the cabin felt alive with something unspoken. The passengers, who had cheered moments earlier, now sat in an uneasy hush, their gratitude colliding with the raw awareness of what had unfolded. They had been saved, yes, but not without the uncomfortable reckoning of how they had watched, waited, and allowed silent prejudices to fester until the moment of crisis. Noah Carter stood at the threshold of the cockpit, the applause already fading behind him. His movements were deliberate, his shoulders squared as he surveyed the cabin. The faces looking back at him told a story: relief, admiration, guilt. It was a gallery of human contradictions. And Noah could read every expression like an open book. Near the galley, Catherine Bell lingered, her body angled as though she might retreat at any moment. Her usual composure had crumbled, leaving behind someone who looked smaller, diminished. She watched Noah, her hands gripping the counter behind her, her lips pressed tightly together as though holding back the words she could no longer avoid. It wasn't just Catherine who struggled in the aftermath. Across the aisle, the young woman with the phone glanced at her screen, replaying the footage she had captured. Her brows furrowed as she whispered to her husband, who nodded solemnly. 2 rows back, an elderly couple exchanged quiet words, their voices low but unmistakably tinged with regret. Even Evan Lopez, who had fought to advocate for Noah, now stood in the shadows, his gaze fixed on the floor. He felt the weight of his earlier silence, the moments he had hesitated to speak up, the times he had told himself it wasn't his place. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice broke the silence. The co-pilot, stepping into the aisle with a clipboard in hand. His voice was calm, but his exhaustion was evident. "We'll be disembarking shortly. Emergency personnel will assist the captain, and we'll guide you through the terminal. Thank you for your patience." The announcement shifted the mood. Passengers moving to gather their belongings, their movements stiff and subdued. But no one moved too quickly. Their eyes kept drifting back to Noah, a man who had emerged from their midst and redefined what they thought they knew. As Noah stepped further into the cabin, an older woman in a floral scarf reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his arm. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all. I wish I'd said something earlier." When she trailed off, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Noah nodded, his expression kind but measured. "I appreciate that," he said simply. He had no interest in absolving anyone of their guilt, not because he was angry, but because he knew they needed to sit with it, to feel its weight. He moved down the aisle, nodding at the murmured thank yous, shaking the hands that reached out to him. Every step felt heavier, not because of the plane but because of the history that hung in the air. It was a history that wasn't just his but belonged to everyone on board, whether they wanted to claim it or not. Near the back of the cabin, a sharply dressed businessman who had been buried in his laptop earlier now stood with his hands clasped tightly in front of him. When Noah approached, the man cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice firm but tinged with unease. "I saw how that flight attendant treated you, and I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my place. But that was wrong. I'm sorry." Noah studied the man for a moment before speaking. "We've all been in that position," he said, his tone steady. "The question is, what do you do the next time?" The man nodded, his gaze dropping. "Next time," he said quietly, "I'll do better." As the passengers began filing out, Catherine found herself rooted to the spot, her feet refusing to move. She watched as Noah exchanged words with each person who approached him, her guilt mounting with every interaction. Finally, as the last of the passengers stepped onto the jet bridge, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Noah," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It was the first time she had said his name aloud, and it hung awkwardly in the air between them. "I need to say something." Noah turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Catherine hesitated, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. "I was wrong," she said finally, her voice breaking. "About you. About everything. I treated you unfairly, and I let my assumptions guide me instead of doing my job. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it." For a long moment, Noah said nothing. He could see the shame in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of her own realization. But he could also see the effort it had taken for her to speak those words, the way she had pushed past her pride and fear. "I'm not the one you need to make it right with," Noah said finally, his tone even, but acknowledging it as the first step. Catherine nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for what you did, for all of us." Noah inclined his head slightly, then stepped past her, his stride purposeful as he exited the plane. In the terminal, a crowd had gathered: airline officials, emergency responders, curious onlookers. The atmosphere buzzed with a mix of relief and tension, the story of the flight already beginning to spread. Among the group stood a senior operations manager, his face serious as he approached Noah. "Mr. Carter," he said, extending a hand. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done today. We're deeply grateful." Noah shook the man's hand, his expression calm. "It wasn't just me," he said, "the co-pilot, the crew, we all played a part." The manager nodded, but his gaze flickered with something else, an awareness of the larger story. The murmurs about Catherine's behavior. The footage already circulating online. "We'll be conducting a thorough review of everything that happened on this flight," the manager said carefully. "And I can assure you, changes will be made." Noah nodded, but his focus was already shifting. He had done what he came to do: land the plane, protect the passengers, navigate the storm. What came next was out of his hands, though he knew it was only the beginning. As Noah walked through the terminal, the faces of the passengers blurred into a mosaic of gratitude and reflection. He could feel their eyes on him, their whispers trailing in his wake. But he didn't need their applause or their pity. What he needed, what the world needed, was for them to remember. To carry this moment with them and let it change the way they saw others. For Noah, the flight wasn't just about surviving the storm in the air. It was about weathering the storm that lived in the hearts of those around him, the one built on centuries of assumptions and fears. Silent but ever present, and in that storm, he had found his clarity, his purpose, to keep moving forward. One flight, one moment, one conversation at a time. The next storm would come. It always did, but Noah Carter was ready. The hum of the terminal buzzed like a restless hive. Noah Carter moved through the crowd with measured steps, the rhythm of his stride belying the weariness that clung to him like a second skin. Around him, fragments of conversations echoed, the chatter of families reuniting, the clipped voices of airline staff, the faint strains of canned announcements, but there was a charge in the air that seemed to follow him. A ripple of recognition that hadn't fully taken shape. At the gate, the passengers of Flight 523 lingered, their voices low, their gazes darting toward Noah like shadows. It wasn't just gratitude that tethered them to him, it was something heavier. They had seen him at his most capable, his most composed, but they had also seen what he had endured to get there. For some, that realization was a mirror they weren't ready to face. Outside the gate, a growing crowd of airline staff and emergency personnel awaited the passengers. Among them stood Thomas Gleason, a senior airline executive with sharp features and a neatly pressed suit. Gleason approached Noah with an outstretched hand, his expression equal parts relief and reverence. "Mr. Carter," Gleason began, his voice rich with the kind of politeness reserved for important moments. "On behalf of the airline, I want to thank you. Your actions today were extraordinary." Noah took the man's hand, his grip firm but unassuming. "I did what needed to be done," he said simply, his voice steady. He wasn't looking for praise, but the weight in Gleason's gaze suggested he was aware of the deeper story simmering beneath the surface. "We'll be following up on the specifics of what happened," Gleason continued, his tone careful. "We've already heard from some passengers about the conduct of our staff." He paused, his eyes flicking briefly toward the crowd of disembarking passengers before returning to Noah. "Rest assured, we take these matters very seriously." Noah inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He knew Gleason's words were rehearsed, that they had been spoken before in other terminals, after other incidents. Still, there was a flicker of something genuine in the man's tone, a sense that he understood this moment carried more weight than the typical PR crisis. As the passengers filed past, a young woman stepped forward, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. Her name tag read Samantha, and her face was a mix of determination and hesitation. She had recorded much of what had happened on the plane, from Catherine's cold dismissals to the murmurs of disapproval among the passengers. "Excuse me," Samantha said, her voice steady but soft. "I thought you might want to see this." She held out her phone, the screen glowing with the still frame of Catherine standing stiffly beside Noah's seat. Gleason's face darkened as he watched the footage, his lips pressing into a thin line. Behind him, other staff members craned their necks, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort. "This isn't just about today," Samantha said, her tone growing firmer. "This kind of thing happens all the time. People just don't always have the courage to speak up." Her words hung in the air, daring someone to challenge them. Noah watched her, a quiet admiration stirring within him. She was young, but she carried herself with the conviction of someone who had seen enough to know what needed to be said. Back near the gate, Catherine Bell stood alone, her usual poise replaced by a haunted stillness. She had been called aside by a supervisor. A sharp-faced woman who spoke in clipped, quiet tones. Catherine nodded mechanically, her eyes downcast as the supervisor gestured toward a nearby office. The scene caught the attention of Evan Lopez, who had been watching from the sidelines. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, his movements tentative but resolute. "Catherine," Evan said, his voice low. She looked up, her expression wary. I think you should know. People noticed. They noticed everything." Her eyes flicked away, her shoulders stiffening. "I don't need a lecture." "Evan," she said, her voice brittle. "It's not a lecture," he replied. "It's a reminder. You have a choice now. You can keep pretending this was just a bad day. Or you can face it and do better." Catherine's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Evan waited a moment longer, then sighed and turned away, leaving her to grapple with the weight of his words. As Noah stepped into the bustling concourse, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see the elderly woman from the flight, her floral scarf now draped loosely around her neck. Her husband stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her arm. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to say thank you again. Not just for landing the plane, but for how you carried yourself. You showed us something today." Noah smiled faintly, his expression softening. "I appreciate that," he said, "but it's not just about me. It's about what we choose to see in each other." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "You're right," she said, "and I hope we can all do better." As they walked away, Noah stood for a moment, watching the ebb and flow of the crowd around him. He had spent a lifetime navigating spaces like this, crowded, restless, filled with the quiet hum of assumptions and judgments. Today had been no different. But it had also been something more. A moment when the undercurrents had broken the surface, forcing everyone to confront what lay beneath. In the distance, a young boy ran to greet his father, his laughter cutting through the noise like sunlight breaking through clouds. Noah watched them for a moment, a faint smile touching his lips. He thought of his own family, of the world his children were growing up in, and of the work that still lay ahead. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Thank you for what you did today. You inspired all of us." Noah paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then, with a deep breath, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked toward the exit. The storm might have passed, but the ripples it left behind were just beginning. The conference room was silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning, a sterile backdrop to the charged atmosphere within. Noah Carter sat at the long, polished table, his hands resting loosely on its surface. Around him sat airline executives, legal advisors, and a few members of the crew from Flight 523. At the head of the table was Thomas Gleason, the senior executive who had greeted Noah at the terminal. His polished exterior was betrayed by the tension in his jaw, the quick, deliberate movements of his pen against the paper in front of him. This wasn't just about Flight 523. Everyone in the room knew that. This was about the kind of story that didn't just stay in the news cycle but lodged itself in the cultural consciousness, forcing people to ask uncomfortable questions. What happened when the assumptions people carried could have cost lives? What happened when those assumptions were woven so deeply into everyday life that they often went unnoticed until they couldn't be ignored any longer? Gleason cleared his throat, his voice breaking the quiet. "Mr. Carter, before we begin, I want to reiterate how grateful we are for your actions during the flight. Without your intervention, the outcome could have been very different." Noah inclined his head slightly, his expression calm. "I appreciate that," he said, his tone measured, "but I didn't come here for gratitude. I came here to talk about what led to that moment." Across the table, Catherine Bell sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table. She hadn't said much since entering the room, but her presence was loud enough. Her face was pale, her usually sharp demeanor replaced by a visible tension that seemed to deepen with every passing second. Evan Lopez sat beside her, his posture straighter than usual. His expression was a mixture of determination and guilt, as though he was trying to will himself into courage. When Noah spoke again, it was as if his words reached directly for Evan. "What happened on that flight wasn't an isolated incident," Noah said, his voice steady but firm. "It was a reflection of something bigger. I've experienced it before on planes. In airports. In places where I've worked. Where I've lived. I see it, feel it, every time someone like Catherine looks at me and assumes I don't belong. Catherine flinched slightly, her fingers tightening around each other. Gleason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, exchanging a glance with one of the advisors. Mr. Carter, Gleason began carefully, we're conducting a thorough review of this situation. Rest assured, there will be accountability. No's gaze didn't waver. Accountability doesn't start with firing one person or issuing a statement. It starts with asking why it happened in the first place. Why the idea that I didn't belong in first class or in the cockpit came so easily to someone like Catherine. And why no one stepped in until it was too late. The room fell silent again, the weight of No's words settling over the table. Finally, Evan spoke, his voice tentative but clear. He's right, Evan said, glancing briefly at Catherine before turning to Gleason. I should have spoken up sooner. I saw what was happening. I felt it, but I told myself it wasn't my place. I thought, it's just a bad moment, she'll calm down. I didn't want to make waves. No's expression softened slightly as he looked at Evan. It's not easy to speak up, he said, his voice gentler now, but silence has its cost. Too, not just for the person being targeted but for everyone who chooses to look the other way. Evan nodded, his face reddening slightly. I've thought about that every day since the flight. He said, I don't want to make that mistake again. Catherine shifted in her seat, her voice breaking through the tension. I want to say something, she said quietly, her eyes finally lifting to meet No's. Her voice was strained, her usual crispness gone. I've replayed that day 100 times in my mind. I see every moment I got it wrong, every glance, every word, and I don't have an excuse. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. I judged you before you even said a word to me. I saw your skin, your suit, and I made assumptions. I thought I was being professional. But I wasn't. I was small, and I was wrong. The words hung in the air, fragile but heavy. Noah studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but firm. It takes courage to admit that, he said, but admitting it isn't the end. It's the beginning. The question is, what will you do differently now? Catherine nodded slowly, her gaze dropping again. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I want to learn. The conversation shifted as Gleason began outlining the airline's planned initiatives. Mandatory diversity training for all employees. A review of hiring and promotion practices. And the establishment of a council to address bias and equity within the company. The words were polished, the plans ambitious, but Noah remained skeptical. He had heard promises before, seen initiatives launched with fanfare only to fade into obscurity. Training programs and councils are a start, Noah said, but they won't change the culture on their own. That takes leadership from the top down and the bottom up. It takes people willing to challenge their own biases, to step in when they see something wrong, even when it's uncomfortable. Gleason nodded, his expression thoughtful. We want you to be part of that leadership, he said. We've been discussing the possibility of bringing you on as a consultant, someone who can guide us through this process. Help us see what we've been missing. Noah hesitated, the weight of the offer pressing on him. He thought of the years he had spent proving himself in cockpits. The battles he had fought just to be seen for what he was, a professional. A pilot, a man who deserved to be where he was. He thought of the passengers on Flight 523, the way their assumptions had shifted when they realized what he was capable of. And he thought of his children, growing up in a world that still struggled to see past the color of their skin. I'll consider it, Noah said finally, but only if you're ready to do the real work. Gleason met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that looked like resolve. We are, he said. As the meeting ended, Catherine lingered near the door, her hands still trembling slightly. When Noah walked past her, she hesitated, then reached out. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not just for what you did on the flight, but for giving me the chance to face this. I'll do better, I promise. Noah nodded, his expression kind but restrained. Promises are easy, he said. Living up to them is harder. Catherine nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'll earn it, she said softly. Outside the conference room, Noah paused, his gaze drifting to the busy terminal beyond the glass walls. He could see the passengers moving through the space, their lives intersecting briefly before diverging again. He thought of the ripples left by Flight 523. The way its story would spread, touching people he would never meet. The storm wasn't over, not for him. Not for Catherine. Not for anyone. But in that moment, as he stood at the crossroads of what had been and what could be, Noah felt a quiet determination settle over him. The work was just beginning, and he was ready to face it. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, leaving the echoes of the past behind him and walking toward the future. The sky stretched wide and unbroken above the runway, its endless expanse a reminder of both possibility and limitation. Noah Carter stood at the edge of the tarmac, the hum of jet engines a steady pulse in the background. He had spent years in places like this, where movement was constant, and everything was about getting from one point to the next. But today, the air felt different, heavier, more charged, as though the world itself was holding its breath. It had been weeks since the flight that changed everything. The airline's apology had made headlines, their promises of reform dissected in newsrooms and living rooms alike. Noah's name had been invoked as both a hero and a reminder. His story a spark in the ongoing struggle for recognition and equity. Yet as the noise swirled around him, Noah remained focused on the work, on what came after the storm. Inside the terminal, the conference room buzzed with quiet anticipation. The airline's leadership had gathered for a presentation on the new diversity and inclusion initiatives. A meeting that had been heralded as the first step toward lasting change. Noah sat at the edge of the room, his presence both a symbol and a challenge. He had agreed to act as a consultant, but only if the work was real, if it pushed beyond platitudes and touched the heart of the culture that had allowed Catherine's actions to fester. As the CEO, Thomas Gleason, began outlining the steps the airline would take: mandatory training, hiring reforms, increased accountability. Noah watched the room carefully. He saw the nods of agreement, the furrowed brows of discomfort. But he also saw the skepticism lingering in the corners, the quiet resistance of those who preferred the status quo. When it was his turn to speak, Noah stood slowly, his gaze sweeping the room. Change, he began, his voice steady but firm, is not something you announce. It's something you live. It's uncomfortable, it's slow, and it's necessary. He let the words settle, the silence stretching as the weight of them sank in. The truth is, what happened on that flight wasn't about one person. It wasn't about Catherine or me. It was about all of us, the assumptions we carry, the ways we fail each other, the silence we justify in the name of keeping the peace. That's what has to change. Later, as the meeting broke, Catherine approached him. She looked different now, less polished, more uncertain, as though she was still figuring out who she was without the armor she had once worn so easily. I've started the training, she said quietly. It's harder than I expected. It should be, Noah replied, his tone neither harsh nor forgiving. If it isn't hard, you're not doing it right. She nodded, her hands fidgeting at her sides. I just wanted you to know. I'm trying. Noah studied her for a moment, then offered a small nod. Keep trying, he said. That's where the real work begins. Outside the terminal, a new group of passengers waited to board, their lives intersecting briefly in the transitory space of the gate. Among them was a young black boy, his wide eyes filled with wonder as he gazed at the planes through the glass. He clutched a toy airplane in his hand, its silver wings catching the afternoon light. Noah watched him for a moment, his chest tightening slightly. The boy reminded him of his own children, of the questions they asked about the world and their place in it. He wondered what it would take to make sure they didn't grow up carrying the same weight he had. To ensure they could walk through spaces like this without feeling the need to justify their presence. The boy's mother noticed Noah and nudged her son gently. Go on, she said, her voice soft but encouraging. The boy approached Noah hesitantly, his small hands clutching the toy plane. Are you a pilot? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Noah smiled, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. I am, he said, and one day, you can be too. The boy's eyes lit up, his smile breaking wide. Really? He asked, his excitement spilling over. Even me? Especially you, Noah said firmly. The sky belongs to all of us. As Noah walked toward his next flight, he felt the familiar pull of the runway beneath him, the steady rhythm of his steps syncing with the hum of the engines. The work wasn't finished, not for him, not for the airline, not for the world that had shaped them both, but it was moving forward, slowly but surely. One conversation, one moment, one choice at a time. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Noah's thoughts drifted to the passengers he had met, the lives he had touched, the ripples that would continue long after this moment. He thought of Catherine, of Evan, of the boy with the toy plane, and of the countless others whose paths might one day cross his. When he stepped into the cockpit, the weight of the day lifted slightly, replaced by the steady calm that came with flight. He settled into the seat, his hands moving instinctively over the controls, the familiar hum of the engines grounding him. "This is your captain speaking," Noah said into the intercom, his voice steady and clear. "We're preparing for takeoff. Thank you for choosing to fly with us today." As the plane taxied down the runway, Noah looked out at the horizon, the endless expanse of sky that stretched before him. The work was far from over. But in that moment, as the plane lifted into the air, he felt a quiet certainty. They were getting closer.